All right, very good afternoon to everyone. Glad to have you with us, Margaret Street Church of Christ, for our live stream on Sunday evening. We're going to give everybody a few moments to log in. As always, it takes just a few moments to get all the live streams out to the different places that we're broadcasting. We are broadcasting live here on Facebook Live, as well as on our Boxcast TV, our website, and also on YouTube. If any of those channels happen to go down, we recommend that you can go try one of the other ones because sometimes, depending on what happens, you might lose the feed. So that's why we try to simulcast these feeds. We are studying an overview of the book of Revelation. We're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 18 tonight. And so if you'll get your Bibles out, we're going to continue our study is Revelation for Real. You know, this study started out several weeks ago when we were in the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, and there were a lot of questions about what's happening in the world. And is this the end of the world? Is this the apocalypse? And things like that. And so we started out by just answering those questions. And this study has then since evolved into just an overview of the book of Revelation, and mainly because of your comments, because of your requests and the statements that you've made to me, and I want to thank you for those, and I'm glad that this study has been beneficial for you. It's been a joy for me to be able to study Revelation again, and so tonight we're going to continue that with chapter 18. It looks like everything is working perfectly. I see YouTube is working well. The Facebook Live is working well. We've got several people logged on. So let's go ahead and get started in Revelation chapter 18. As most of you that have been on this study have noticed that we are back in the auditorium once again. As I mentioned last week, it's quite a lot of work to take all of this studio equipment down to my office and set it up in my office because it has now been installed here to be used in the auditorium on a regular weekly basis. However, I got several comments that said that, they really miss the scene in the office, and I got to admit, I miss being in my office as well. So hopefully we'll have some more equipment coming in real soon that we can have both, that we can have not only this system in the auditorium, but also I can continue studies from my office, and hopefully we'll continue other studies after we even finish Revelation. So with that being said, let's start by looking in Revelation chapter 18. Let's go ahead and read the whole chapter, and then when we're done with that, we'll break down verse by verse of what's going on. And so let's read beginning in verse 1 of chapter 18. And after these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a habitation of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues, for her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mix for her own double. And in the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and I am no widow, and I will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. And the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, the great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and incense, and fragrant oil, and frankincense, wine, and oil, fine flour, and wheat, cattle, and sheep, horses, and chariots, and bodies, and souls of men. And the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. And every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What is like this great city? And they threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you any more. And no craftsman of any craft shall be found in you any more. And the sound of millstones shall not be heard in you any more. And the light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. For by your sorcery all nations were deceived. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all who were slain on the earth. Well, when we read this chapter, first thing is, it doesn't seem quite as shocking, if you will, as compared to many of the other chapters that we've been studying up to this point. Because all the other chapters that we've read to this point have introduced all these strange figures and these different things that we see, like beasts and dragons and all these things with 10 heads and coming up out of the sea and out of the sand and all kinds of things like that that's kind of scary, the mark of the beast and all that. Here, this whole chapter deals with one thing. And so it's focusing on now just one particular part of that, those 7 symbolic figures that we studied a few weeks ago. If I go back up to this, yes? Volume. All right. What are they saying, they can't hear?
Yeah, it's too low.
Too low. Look on the USB volume and turn that up just a little bit. Tell you what, do me a favor. I'm sorry that just got our technical advisor is helping us out here. All right, so a little knob that says USB on it.
Back here.
Yep. Just turn it up a little bit, and that should hopefully make a difference. Technical difficulties every time. All right, so if you will, on this computer right here, the big computer, if you'll click on the one that looks like a graph there, that looks like, see the graph going up and down? Just click on the top of it. Click on the top of it. The black graph that you see going up and down. Sorry for this, folks. There we go. Yeah, looks like the volume is working just fine, so I'm not sure what's happening in regards to people saying it's not loud enough, so hopefully it's coming through. All right, so continuing the study. In fact, I'll just check right here. We've been studying up to this point. Yeah. So if you're not getting it on Facebook, it's definitely coming through on the YouTube channel. All right. So as we look through this, we are focusing on one thing. And as I was saying, we're looking at those 7 symbolic figures. I'm going to bring this up, and this will show you what we're talking about that we introduced in chapters 12 through 14. And it says in those chapters, first of all, you have a woman, which was that woman who was arrayed with the sun, who was giving birth to a child, and then there was a dragon sitting there, and that dragon was trying to devour the child. You remember all this that we studied in chapter 12? And then chapter 13, you see the beast of the sea that rose up, and then after that, you see the beast of the earth that rose up, and then you see those that were marked by the beast, and then just real briefly in that chapter it mentioned the harlot, or it mentioned Babylon. Well, then after that, we kind of take a little bit of a pause, and it looks into those 7 bowls of wrath. And then last week, we now focus back on that last one. Let me get my fingers right here. I can always get that wrong. This last one right here of the harlot of Babylon. And so, in that is now what we're focusing on. And he explained, remember last week, what Babylon is and why it's called that harlot. And so, now is a continuation. Now we see the judgment of that harlot. So after these things, he says that an angel came and coming. Is that everything working now, Andrea, by the way? All right. I got Andrea helping me out on this, and she's trying to make sure everything is working.
That USB knob is all the way up.
Okay. Pete just sent me a text, said YouTube is okay. So maybe if we look on that. All right. So, get my thoughts back here. This angel comes out with great authority, and he cries out with a voice saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. All right, so this is the judgment scene of this great city, and we need to remember what that Babylon stands for, because this is where people start to get confused. And that's what I have written here, other direction, right there, is Babylon represents that evil community, the dwelling, just like we had Zion. You remember we had this comparison. I'm going to bring this up because this is so important to remember as we're studying this, because there's been some confusion as to what these things mean. So if you look at this comparison, and this is what is presented in chapters 12 all the way up to now, really, is 2 sides. You see this spiritual side and you see a physical side. The spiritual side of this is Satan versus God. The physical side is what the people are experiencing in persecution, what Christians are experiencing. And so what I want you to notice in this chart that I have on there to help you remember is that, remember the 2 beasts that come up, those are allies of Satan, as well as you have the other side of that, the contrast of that. An ally of God is his son, who is also called the Lion of the tribe of Judah, or the Lamb. But then you also have those that were marked by the beast. You also have those that were called the 144,000 that were sealed by God himself. And so you see, again, this contrast. Well, it's the same way with Babylon. And that's the part we need to remember. And this is why I'm bringing this up, because a lot of commentaries and different writers have different points of view on this. And as I've said many times, there's nobody who's a true expert in Revelation. So a lot of it is just we're trying to figure this out, and a lot of it is just our best interpretations. So some people will say that Babylon and the Babylon and the harlot are the same thing as the false prophet that we saw, that beast that came up out of the earth, remember? And it was called the false prophet, and we'll see that again even in the next chapter. And so people equate that the harlot and the false prophet are the same thing, riding on the back of the beast out of the sea, which is the nations. Well, other commentators say, no, it's the beast of the sea. And that's why I think it's important for charts like this one that shows you, well, there's a contrast that's taking place. Just like Mount Zion, okay, is that holy community. Well, it's made up of the Lamb. It's made up of the 144,000. It's made up of those saved. All right, so that's just another way of saying it. Well, that's the same way you should look at Babylon. Babylon is made up of those marked by the beast. It's made up of the 2 beasts. And so they're all intertwined. They're all connected. The Babylon comes up out of the beast, as well as either one of those beasts. I'm getting more text here. It says everything is working fine on Boxcast stuff as well. Thanks, y'all, for your text and for helping me out on that. It really is a big help. I appreciate it. All right, so if you look at it that way, hopefully it makes more sense whenever you see now this judgment that's taking place on Babylon. So, it talks about Babylon being the habitation of demons. Now, doesn't that make more sense with this chart that we have here whenever we talk about, go back to this one, when it talks about the harlot, that's not the one I wanted. Let me go back to this one. There we go. That should be the one. Talking about that harlot being the evil community. Well, look what it says. It is a place, a habitation of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, a cage for every unclean and hated bird. I read some interesting commentary on this that I'd never considered before about that bird, the caged bird. I've never really given any thought about that before, but it is interesting that it mentions that. Well, if you go to Matthew chapter 13, Jesus is teaching several parables about the kingdom. And in one of those parables, he talks about the mustard seed. Do you remember that? And the mustard seed, he talks about how it grows. It grows from a little bitty seed, grows into almost like a tree, so big that birds can come and nest in that tree. Now, isn't that interesting whenever you do these comparisons, because there the birds come and freely nest in this tree that represents the kingdom of God, yet here in Revelation you have these birds that are in Babylon, this kingdom of evil, if you will, and they're caged. I just found that quite interesting. Then it goes on to say, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now what that means basically, when you drink of the wrath of and have committed fornication with this harlot, it means that you have accepted the sinful behaviors. It means that you participated in it. And so the evil people, the ones that are marked by the beast, the ones of this evil community of Babylon, they have partaken in idolatry. They've partaken in sinful behaviors that have basically, they've given over to a complete and total, there are no spiritual values, let's put it that way. They have no spiritual values. Instead, it's all about the earthly. It's all about their own pleasure and things like that. And so it says that, and with her the merchants of the earth became rich through the abundance of luxury. Isn't that what the world's all about? It's, get the best for you and do all that you can and make as much money as you can. That old saying, he who dies with the most toys wins. Well, I also heard, he who dies with the most toys, he still dies. And there's still a reckoning that needs to take place. And that's kind of what this is showing. It's a worldly view, showing what the world it focuses on. And that's why you have in verse 4, you hear a call to come out of that. And he says, come out of her, my people, lest you share. So this is, again, you've heard me say several times that you need to understand and know the Bible in order to understand Revelation. This makes me think of what God was saying to Abraham whenever he was getting ready to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham was pleading, are there people there that are being called out? Or what about when God sent Jonah to Nineveh, because there were still people there that would bow down to him? You see, God always gives an opportunity for those to come out to repent. God always gives you an opportunity to come out of sin, to come out of darkness, to come out of that kingdom of Babylon, the harlot, if you will, of being marked by the beast, of being part of that evil kingdom. God always gives you an opportunity to come out, to repent, and that's what he's saying here. So it's symbolism to come out of sin. It also kind of harkens back to Exodus, whenever he called his people out of Egypt, out of slavery. Isn't that how Paul describes sin, is that we are slaves of sin? And so here, this is all this strong imagery. Then he says, for her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. God tells us in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12, that he will remember our sins no more. That's for those who have obeyed the gospel, who have put on Christ in baptism, who have put on that garment of salvation. God no longer remembers your sins. But what's the opposite of that? If you're a sinner, he's going to remember everything that you did. And isn't that interesting? We see that right here when he says God remembered her iniquities. Then he says, render to her just as she rendered to you. Repay her double according to her works. Galatians chapter 6, verse 8 says very clearly that you're going to reap what you sow. And so in this case, the harlot is going to receive what she's been reaping. She's going to get that. She's been sowing that. She's going to reap this. And it says double. Again, I find the language of the Bible fascinating because, one of the things in the Old Testament is that the firstborn would receive a double portion of the inheritance. You think about so much that is related to this. I also think of James chapter 3 verse 1 that says, don't let many of you become teachers because you will be held at a higher accountability. Paraphrasing that verse right there. But again, double. Elders that serve in the church should be counted as double honor, worthy of double honor. And so this idea of double even extends over to judgment. So very important. And notice that it says according to her works. Again, Galatians 6, 8. And what that teaches us is that we're going to be held accountable for our actions, for the things that are against God. Now, let me back up on this just a little bit. We've been following a outline, and this outline has been 7 parts, and we are now in the 6th part of that, and it's the Sevenfold Judgment. I should have showed you this at the beginning of the study. Got distracted with the technical difficulty. Sorry about that. But this is a continuation now. We're in the 6th part of that, and I call it the Sevenfold Judgment. And you can see here that we're now into chapter 18, and we're starting to get into those elements of that, those 7 aspects, the 7 part. And so you see the first one, verses 1 through 3. That's where Babylon is fallen. That's the first thing that you see in this chapter is talk about just one of these facets, one of these aspects of this judgment. And the next thing you saw is this call to come out. So he's calling you, the people, to come out, and that's where we are right now. And so that way you have this to follow along, but you continue in this, as it says, in the measure that she will glorify herself and live luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. Luke chapter 6, verse 38 is a great passage. It talks about our works and the things that we will receive. Luke chapter 6, verse 38 reads, give, and it will be given to you. Good measure. Listen to this. Pressed down, shaken together, running over, and will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. Another way of saying, with whatever judgment you use, you will be judged by. By whatever goodness you give, you will get that goodness back. And so here you see that same message of give to her the same measure that she glorified herself, give it back to her in torment and sorrow. And that phrase, I sit as queen and am no widow, I will not see sorrow. In other words, she's a queen in her own right. She came about this for herself. She wasn't made queen because she was the wife of some king and then became a widow. She came out of her own royal line, if you will. She did this on her own. All right, so he's calling people out of this. He's calling those to repent from this. And that's why I have on there going all the way up to verse 10. And really, verse 9, now we start to see a different section here. In verse 9, we start to see the consequences of this judgment that's taking place. You've heard me say a few times in this study, there's lots of different ways to divide up the books of the Bible. You can divide them up in different ways. Sometimes there's these real natural divisions, and sometimes they're not so natural. Well, this is just another example, as you see with the outline that, this way, the outline that I have there. I have it marked up to verse 10 for this second point, the call to come out. But another way of dividing this is beginning in verse 9, as I just said, and now you're going to see the consequences of this fall. And so the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxury with her. These are, when it's talking about kings, these are people that made themselves wealthy. They were all in. They were involved in this sinful behavior. And so here they are. And notice it says that the ones that were there, they're sad, but notice that they are standing at a distance. And so, have you ever noticed how that happens whenever somebody is, let's use the word or the phrase, taken down? You know, whenever you think about sometimes when people are brought to judgment, and all of a sudden, all of their associates, what do? They separate themselves from us. Like, oh, I don't know that person, or they try to distance themselves from that person. Isn't that interesting, human nature? And we see that even in this, whenever they're standing at a distance looking at the city that has fallen. Yet they partook in sin. They're going to be judged just like the woman, just like the harlot, just like the city Babylon itself. And then it goes on to say, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. Now, that's an interesting phrase that's repeated a couple of times in this chapter, and it simply means with the swiftness that God will render judgment. You think about how long it takes to build a city. It takes anywhere from a few months if you're building a pop-up city or something, but typically a city takes years upon years, even centuries to build. And so you imagine all that energy that was put in to build a big city. Imagine you think of Rome. That's what would be in the minds of the first century Christians, how big that city was, and that's the focal point of everything. Think about the cities we have today and how long it took to build those cities. And yet, this is showing that it will be fallen. It'll be over in an hour. In an hour the judgment comes, and it'll wipe everything out. Now I want you to notice all the things that happens. And you go into this list that we read earlier where the merchants are weeping and mourning. All right, and that's now we get into this next part of this outline. You'll see there number 3, the merchants will mourn, verses 11 through 20. It's because it's impacted their well-being and their livelihood. And that's one of the pictures that you need to see of this, of the judgment that God is rendering on this evil city. The opposite of Zion is that, just imagine a city, a major city, being destroyed in an instant. What impact that would have economically around the world. If you really stop and think about it, you know, Babylon was the center of that world, the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian world. And you can imagine when that city fell, the impact that had on the economy all around the region and the far spread impact. What about Rome? When Rome falls, and that's again what people would be thinking about, the impact that would have on the world economy. You know, if, let's say, New York City or something like that were to just instantly be destroyed, it would have an enormous impact on the economy of the world. And so you can imagine why these people are weeping and mourning. And then it goes into this list of all the things that man looks to be important. All this silk and wood and gold and all these things, the cinnamon, the incense, all things that man holds precious. But in reality, you know the old saying, you can't take it with you. When we're talking about spiritual things here, those mean nothing. The only thing that really matters, the most valuable thing that you own, is your soul. And that's what you need to be concerned about. And yet here you see the opposite of that. You see these men that's meaning mankind. This is men and women. Mankind more concerned about all these goods. Now there's an interesting part of verse 13. When it talks about, it goes into that cinnamon and oil and frankincense and everything, and sheep and horses and chariots. Now the New King James says sheep and horses and chariots at the end of that verse, and bodies and souls of men. Now, depending on what version you're using, it uses the word slave in there. And so there's been all kinds of commentaries about slaves. Well, the word that's actually there is the word body. It's just, so when it says, like the New King James says, and bodies and souls, that's the actual word that's there. For some reason, the King James and others translated that as slaves, but it still fits because what is merchandise sometimes? Human beings. And if you have a city that's fallen, and when you think about the Roman Empire back in that day and age, it's estimated there were some 60 million slaves throughout the entire Roman Empire. So if Rome did indeed fall, as the picture is depicting here, and that's what, again, people would connect with, and we're going to talk about that more in just a second. People would connect Rome with this Babylon. They would see and understand, well, that means, man, it's wiping out everything, including those slaves. And then it goes on to talk about the fruit will be gone and all that that will be. Now, it also mentions souls. The souls of men, they're no longer being sold. And that sounds kind of weird. How do you buy and sell souls? Again, some interesting commentary that talks about, well, we've seen that throughout time, where people could pay to help their dead relatives and pray for them or get them out of a bad situation. Like, for example, in some religions where it talks about purgatory and things like that, there was a time when you could pay a certain amount of money and get them out of purgatory or get them a pass or something like that. And so you see how this really goes beyond what would be just Rome. This is any evil city, any evil dwelling, any place that would be considered the community of evil. That's what you need to see here. Just like Zion is the community of the faithful, which could also be the church, which could be the kingdom of heaven. There's lots of different names for it. This is just a synonym for that community of evil. And so in this case, anything that's involved in that, like what we just talked about, is part of this, and it's described here. Goes on to describe these merchants that were still standing at a distance. They're not going to get close to her, and yet they're weeping more for themselves now than they are for the woman, the harlot, the city, because they're lost, what they're going to lose out of this. There's another interesting point that's brought out in verse 17. As I mentioned just a moment ago, that this is not necessarily only Rome. The first century readers who read this would have made the connection that this was looking at Rome, but this is for all Christians. It's to encourage all Christians. And here's one way that we know that. Verse 17, for in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Once again, that quick judgment. Imagine destroying an entire city in 1 hour. And it says, every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and many traded the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like this great city? Well, if you know anything about geography, you know that Rome is not a port city, that you can't sit in a ship and stand off in a distance and see Rome from a distance in a ship. Now, I do know that there's some archaeological finds that shows where they had a canal that was dug to get closer up in towards Rome, but Rome was not a port city where you got ships sailing in and out of it. Babylon wasn't really a port city to some degree, even though it was on a mighty river, and there were ships coming in and out of there, but it's not like an ocean or a mighty sea port city. And so this shows you that this is symbolism. Isn't that what we've been saying throughout this entire study? Is it symbolism, symbolism, symbolism? We can't all of a sudden make something literal when we've been talking about symbolism all this time. And so the symbolism continues through this, but describes any evil city. And what the focus is all this buying and selling and focusing on earthly goods. What did Jesus say? He said, where your heart is where your treasure, or where your treasure is where your heart will be. And to lay up for yourself treasures in heaven and not on the earth, to paraphrase Matthew 6 there. And so as we look at this, we need to understand, let's talk about spiritual things, and these are people focusing on physical, worldly, earthly things, and that's what Satan and that's what Satan's allies, the beast, want you to focus on. Friends and brethren, that's what's happening even in the world today. With all the things that are happening in our society with with all the racial tensions and the pandemic and everything else, this is Satan using these things to take our focus off of religious things. These are important things that we need to be concerned about, but our home is not here. Our home is in heaven, and that's what Revelation is teaching the people who read it in the first century. It's what it needs to teach us even today in this century. All right, so we continue on, and it says, they cried out, and they saw the smoke of her burning. What is like this great city? And they threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city, in which who had the ships in the sea become rich by her wealth. All right, so this is what's going to become. This is going to come to all those inhabitants of the evil city, of the harlot, the evil community. This is what's going to become of them. They're going to be throwing ash on their head. This is a cultural thing from back in the first century. Whenever people would put on sackcloth, they would put dust and ashes on their head and mourn and wail out, is all part of their culture. It seems a little bit strange to us as Americans because we don't do something like that. But in the first century, they would have understood that. They'd be familiar with it. And the point you need to see is it is just the opposite of what's in another part of Revelation. And we'll refer back to this when we get to that. But hold your finger here, and if you see, remember I keep telling you, this is where the contrast comes in, that you have Babylon, and then you have Zion. Zion's also that New Jerusalem. That's, again, a synonym. So you have this weeping and wailing that's going on in Babylon. But now look over in chapter 20. If we jump real quick over a couple of chapters to chapter 20, verse 4, here's a picture of Zion. Actually, it's called the New Jerusalem. And we'll explain all that when we get to that chapter. That says God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no sorrow, no crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Remember that as you're studying Revelation. We've been going now through this study for quite some time. You've heard me say over and over about the symbolism, about first century readers, and all. And this is another point you need to get, is all these contrasts that Revelation uses, that the vision uses. This is a literary device to help you remember these things and see the importance of them. And so they threw dust, and they were sad. All right, well now we get into, as you can see here in the outline once again, number 4, the fourth aspect. These are basically elements, if you will, that I divided this out into this judgment scene, which, as you can also see from the outline, continues into the next chapter. And the next chapter begins a very interesting turn of events and sequence that we'll explain next week, that will really start to put Revelation together for you. And it starts here, but it really climaxes in the next chapter, and you can see it there. By the way, this outline is available on our sermon notes, on our interactive sermon notes, where you can go on there and fill this in and follow along with the study. But now we get into a judgment scene that's called the millstone, the great millstone. The first thing we see is verse 20, is it says, Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Now, one thing about Revelation that is interesting is the way the vision works. John is seeing this as if it's already happened. He's seeing it as if it's the present looking back. But yet, it hasn't happened yet. The final judgment, we're still here in the year 2020, and the final judgment, none of this has happened yet. And so what we're seeing is a glimpse into heaven, a glimpse into what the end of the world is going to be like, what the end of time is going to be like. And so that's what we're seeing here. This is also an extended section of chapters 4 and 5, whenever you see that throne room scene. And so he says, Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets. And listen to this part again. For God has avenged you for her. avenged you on her. Now, if you just look at, for example, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 37, you kind of get a glimpse of why that verse is there. Hebrews 11, verse 37 says that, talking about the people who were the voices of for God, the spokespeople for God, like prophets. And it says in verse 36, still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. Then look in verse 37, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. So these are the prophets of old, and you think about the way some of the prophets were treated. Tradition says that Isaiah was the one he's talking about there that was sawn in two. Tradition, again, we don't have anything that's written in the scriptures, but just things that were passed down through time, that Peter, for example, was crucified upside down. That we know that Paul was most likely executed there in Rome. And all the apostles were martyred in one way or the other, except for the apostle John, who is here writing this, one of the last, the last apostle to live. And so when he says he's going to avenge you, the apostles and the prophets, this is an extension of chapter 6. You remember in chapter 6 when we had those seals? And that one seal, the fifth seal, was the martyrs. And you remember what they said? They said, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge, and listen to it, avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth. And so the prophets and the apostles were included in those martyrs, those souls that were under the altar. So see how this is woven throughout the book of Revelation. It's all connected, yet it's these different visions looking at it from different points of view, different perspectives. And now you see the complete, total, and final judgment of Babylon, the harlot. Then a mighty angel. I love how Revelation, we keep seeing all these angels. Remember, angels are messengers. They're also the ones that execute God's commands. This mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, thus the violence of great city of Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore. So here it is. Here's the end. This is what's going to happen to Babylon. And it's so graphic. When you stop and think about it, if you've ever seen a millstone, these things are huge. They have to be big. They have to be heavy. And it's usually a circular stone that has a hole in the middle of it because it's set up on its end, and a piece of wood, a log is put through there, and it's attached to another log, and it goes in a circle, and it's heavy, and it crushes grapes or olives or grain or things like that with its weight in order to process it. So you can imagine taking this heavy, this giant stone and putting it around the neck of someone and then throwing them into the sea. It'd be the equivalent to what we would say giving them concrete boots. You've heard of that with the old mob stories and stuff like that. Well, this is even worse. And it is paralleled. If it's paralleled to what Jesus said. Remember Jesus, Matthew chapter 18? Matthew chapter 18, verse 6, he says, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin. And he's talking about children here, but he's using children to talk about his own disciples. If you cause one of my disciples to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the depth of the sea. Again, you see how the Bible is so connected, and even in this vision, John here is being shown this connection back that people would have made to Matthew's account of the gospel. And how here is exactly what happens. Thrown into the sea. Now, things that are thrown into the sea, there's no sign left. There's nothing, for example, talk about a city being destroyed. Well, you could, as what comes to my mind, for example, if you think of let's say, Pompeii, from that day and age was destroyed by a volcano. Well, they've dug up Pompeii, and you can see the ruins. Even if you think about something like Hiroshima that was destroyed by the nuclear bomb, there's still evidence there. You can see what's left over, the foundations and stuff like that. There's things that you can see in evidence. When you cast something into the sea, it's gone. There is no evidence. You don't see anything. There's nothing left behind. That is a graphic picture or image of how complete God's destruction of Babylon will be. It'll be rendered judgment so complete that nothing will be left behind. And notice the refrain that's repeated over and over as it goes on to talk about all the things that once flourished in that sinful city. All the things like harpists and musicians. And it says, notice the phrase over and over, and it will be not heard in you anymore. Craftsmen, that craft, you think about all the things that cities provide and have in them. If you want to get something made, if you want, some of the best craftsmen are going to be found typically in the cities, and it'll be found in you no more. It goes on to talk about the sound of the millstone will not be heard in you. In other words, that producing of harvest, whenever you get the harvest and you process it, it will not be found in you anymore. It goes on to talk about the light of a lamp. Not even light. There won't even be the glimpse of light. Will not be found in you anymore. There's some symbolism in that. Jesus was the light of the gospel that is come into the world, and this evil city is going to be destroyed, and no longer will there be any light within it. It will be nothing but darkness. The bridegroom and the bride are heard in you no more, for your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. And so, whenever Jesus says it's better for a millstone to be hung around the neck of somebody who caused my little ones to sin, this is exactly a picture of that. Babylon, the harlot, seduced men into committing sin, to participating in evil deeds of breaking God's commands. And so here you see that judgment of that millstone being used to cast her into the sea. But why? What was the main thing? All those things that she did was bad. But the main thing that she did is in verse 24, because in her, notice it says, all those things are not going to be found in you anymore. But in you, what was found was the blood of the prophets and the saints and all who were slain in the earth. This is her worst offense. This is the ultimate reason for judgment. This goes all the way back to chapter 12, when it all began with the dragon standing there before the woman trying to devour the child, and God protected the child and carried the child away to heaven. Paraphrasing that. But then those that were left, the offspring of the woman, the church, was persecuted by the dragon. And then he brings up these beasts. Going back to our parallels here, he brings up these beasts, and then those beasts cause people to be the same thing is happening here with the harlot, cause them to bow down to idols and to worship the dragon, because that's who they work for, the beasts. And then you create this community, Babylon, the harlot. And so there's the real meaning behind all this. So whenever you have commentaries that want to make the harlot a certain thing, I suppose that's okay, but I think there's a lot more to it whenever you consider this contrast, this comparison that we see there. And so, in the end, what we have learned is that evil will be punished. God, over and over, has shown us that he will render justice. That's the point of showing these visions. As in each time, God will render justice. We've seen it in the bowls. We saw it in the trumpets. We saw it even in the seals. We've seen it over and over. God is not mocked. God will not be dishonored. God will render judgment. And that's what we need to see. So going back to our outline here one more time, and we looked at, here's that picture we had from last week of that harlot sitting on that beast. This is just imagery. It's symbolism of any community that is anti-God. It is symbolism of what comes out of, what comes out of any anti-God government, in any anti-God false religion. You see, they're all interconnected. You have to have a community before you have a government. You have to have a community before you have false religion. And so that's how they're all interconnected. But next week, we're going to look at chapter 19. And you're going to see there, as you can see on our outline there, that there is this, what's called the celebration in heaven. And then there is an interesting pattern that starts to unfold right there in chapter 19. It actually starts here, but I don't want to ruin what we're going to show you, because it's really going to be highlighted in the next chapter as we start to see something unfold, which will then lead us into the last section of our outline, and that is the sevenfold triumph. This book ends in triumph. This book is about encouragement. And so I hope that tonight this has encouraged you as you have studied with me the book of Revelation. Again, I apologize for some of the technical difficulties, but again, thank you for those who sent me messages and things like that to help us get those under control. And again, I thank you for joining us on these studies. I'm enjoying doing this study very much. Appreciate your comments. And next week, Lord willing, we'll be right back here, and we're going to look at Revelation chapter 19 to wrap up this section of this sevenfold judgment and start to look at the grand climax, the sevenfold triumph. And it just gets more and more exciting as we move along. So again, thank you. I hope you have a great rest of your week. I hope that God blesses you in many ways, and we'll see you next